Welcome back to our lecture. In this segment of the lecture, I want to talk about an AWS service called Elastic Beanstalk. An Elastic Beanstalk is platform as a service. If you recall, there were three main types of cloud computing business models. There was infrastructure as a service, which we've been using mostly up until this point. That's where you can launch infrastructure components like VPCs and EC2 instances, elastic load balancers, and so on. And you are responsible for selecting the operating system, configuring the OS, maintaining security patches, installing your application, and so on. Then there was platform as a service. With platform as a service, the cloud provider is responsible for maintaining and managing the infrastructure, including the operating system, and you, the customer, are responsible for the application code. Elastic Beanstalk is a platform as a service, and it will automate the creation and management of the AWS infrastructure for you, so that as a customer, all you need to really focus on is building and deploying your custom application. Now, you're probably thinking, well, Jason, how come you made me, spend all this time through this course so far learning about all of these different infrastructure components? When I could have just used this Elastic Beanstalk service to kind of build all the infrastructure for me. And then I could just focus on writing my application code. Well, that's true to a certain extent. I think it's really important to understand how the underlying infrastructure components work, because the Elastic Beanstalk is just simply automating the creation of things like EC2 instances, S3 buckets, RDS databases, the elastic load balancers, and so on. It's using all of the different infrastructure components that we've learned in this course to support applications. The Elastic Beanstalk service is primarily used and oriented towards application developers that just simply don't want to, deal with the underlying infrastructure. Maybe they just don't have time to learn how to architect the infrastructure properly. Or in some cases, I've seen companies that make heavy use of Elastic Beanstalk, and what they're doing is they're essentially providing their application development teams with a very simple self-service interface that they can use to deploy their in-house applications. And that way, the application development teams don't have to really think about or worry about infrastructure. They can focus on their code, and they can use the Elastic Beanstalk service to deploy their application code. Elastic Beanstalk supports a number of different application frameworks, anything from Java, PHP, Python, Ruby, Go, .NET applications, Node applications, Docker containers, and so on. And the list just keeps expanding every single year. Now, the Elastic Beanstalk service will control and manage the underlying infrastructure, but you can still access that infrastructure, and you can actually still tweak the configuration of that infrastructure to a certain extent. When you deploy your application in an Elastic Beanstalk environment, you need to select a deployment policy for your application. And there are a handful of different deployment policies you can choose from. You can choose to deploy your application all at once. You can imagine the Elastic Beanstalk environment spins up 5 different EC2 instances, and you want to deploy your application to all of those instances. Well, if you use the all-at-once deployment model, then Elastic Beanstalk will update all of those EC2 instances at the same time. Now, if you are like updating your software on those servers, there might be a short disruption. If your customers are currently accessing those web applications and you decide to do an all-at-once deployment, then your customers may experience a short outage. Sometimes we call this a big bang deployment. Another type of deployment policy you can use is the rolling deployment. And with the rolling deployment, the Elastic Beanstalk service will deploy your application in batches. So instead of updating all of your servers at the same time, it might update just one server at a time. So if you have 5 servers, it'll update the first one, and then the second one, the third one, and so on. It can also do a rolling update with an additional batch. And essentially what that will do is that when it's updating a server, it will actually launch a new resource, like a new EC2 instance with that update, so that service capacity isn't reduced. I mean, imagine you had 5 web servers, and if you were updating them one at a time, then for a short period of time, only 4 web servers would be available to your customers because one would be kind of taken out of service for updating purposes. And that would reduce the amount of computing capacity available to your customers. In order to mitigate that problem, you could do a rolling with additional batch. So the Elastic Beanstalk service will spin up an additional EC2 instance so that 5 instances are always serving your customers at any given point in time. And then finally, the Elastic Beanstalk service can do an immutable deployment. And with an immutable deployment, what will happen is that instead of updating our 5 EC2 instances, the Elastic Beanstalk service will launch 5 brand new EC2 instances that have our new software deployed on them. And once those new instances have been launched, it will then switch the request to the new 5 instances, and it will terminate the 5 old ones. This is oftentimes called a blue-green deployment, and we'll look at this in a little bit more detail later on in the course.